Full disclosure, the voice you are listening to now is artificially generated, brought to you by satisphonic.com. See the link in the description for more details. Who was vilified in their time, but in hindsight was completely right? Dr. Claire Patterson not only discovered that the true age of the Earth with his research in lead dating, but during this process he accidentally discovered the dangers of lead contamination. Then he went, wait, we're putting this shit in gasoline, cans, paint, etc. He then began campaigning against lead in everyday products. In particular, he targeted the gasoline industry. You can imagine how that went in the courtroom. He was vilified, excluded and slandered against, but kept pushing for lead to be removed from gasoline. Took decades, but obviously lead was removed from gasoline almost entirely by 1990. Humanity keeps rediscovering how bad lead is. Romans knew it was bad, but people still decided it couldn't be that bad and put it in everything. It's because for 99% of the things lead was historically used for, it was safe enough until it wasn't. Lead pipes. Depending on the makeup of the water, the inside would develop a coating that would protect the water itself, unless the coating dissolved and leached into the water. Lead utensils are plates, safe-ish with most foods, until you have something acidic, like tomatoes, and now you're eating lead and blaming the tomatoes for the poisoning. And for the majority of human society, the pros outweighed the cons, because lead was an easy-to-work with metal that had a melting point you could reach with a campfire. We don't use lead anymore, not because we know it's poisonous now, we've always known that, but because we have much better materials to work with. Nan Britton had an affair with us-President Warren G. Harding in the early 1920s. Harding died of a heart attack in 1923, and Britton tried to sue for child support. She was ridiculed in court. In 2015, Ancestry.com did a DNA ancestry, did a DNA analysis on Harding's and Britton's descendant. None was telling the truth. The same thing happened to the children of Thomas Jefferson's slave mistress. To this day, there are Jefferson descendants who refuse to recognize them, despite DNA evidence. They were also the only slaves that Jefferson ever freed. What's crazy is that the slaves were only like 18 black yaks, so they probably looked white. Makes me wonder how many white people these days were actually descended from people who were mostly white and were mostly white and were enslaved. Like, if this information was out there, I wonder if people's attitudes on race would be different. I'm half black and have 5 nieces-nephews that are 14 black. 3 of them don't look black at all, and the other 2 could easily pass for white if they straightened their dirty blonde curls. It's just a racist myth that 1 drop of black blood makes you look African. I mean, there are a lot of Jefferson descendants. They have a society, Jeffersonian Society, let the Hemmings descendants in when DNA proof was furnished. They have a society and a starship. I am one of those descendants, and I think it was too many of us for a payout. Claire Patterson. In addition to being an accomplished scientist, he was attacked for decades due to his controversial view that lead in gasoline was harmful. He was eventually vindicated, and his contributions to removing lead from gasoline may place him among the most important people for human health in modern times. The Bill Nye Reboot had a great segment on him. Keep in mind, this guy wasn't vilified because they thought he was wrong. He was vilified because oil companies knew that he was right, but did not want to own up to the fact that they were poisoning the air and people, because that meant that they would have to lose money. They seriously would have rather destroy society than lose money. Thank God things are different now. The sarcasm. It hurts. They seriously would have rather destroy society than lose money. Thank God things are different now. Yes, was going to see if he was mentioned. Saw a documentary on his story somewhere and couldn't believe he just kept going on about how dangerous lead was in gas. Painted such, even when they did everything they could to shut him down, shut him up. Glad he persisted, truly a man with strong conviction. Was searching the thread to see if someone else posted this. He was steadfast, despite the automotive industry doing everything it could to discredit him and destroy his career. Incidentally, the reason he discovered lead pollution was because he was measuring the radioactive decay of uranium into lead to try to calculate the age of the Earth, and in fact became the first person to successfully do so. His calculation of 4.55 billion years, published in 1956, is virtually unchanged since then. Lindy Chamberlain, the Adingo, killed my baby lady. She was vilified, mocked and ridiculed across the world. She then spent 3 years in prison before it turned out she was actually telling the truth the whole time, and a dingo did, in fact, kill her baby. Local Aboriginal people literally told authorities that the dingoes in the area were known to attack young kids, and an experienced Aboriginal tracker had found tracks indicating that a dingo in the area had been dragging an unusually heavy object. All that, and people still vilified her. Not an Australian, but it seems bizarre to me that people thought what are basically wild dogs killing a human baby was even far-fetched to begin with. I think she was acting very strangely due to obvious trauma. My mum said that she said something weird like dingo peeled baby's clothes off like an orange peel or something like that. Another case of the law not working well for strange or just unlikable people. The Australian government. But they are brown savages. What could they possibly know from tens of thousands of years living here? Australian government, any and all help into finding out the truth will be appreciated. Aboriginals, well, actually, Australian government, no, not from you. I cannot even imagine what it must have been like to lose your baby in a tragic accident and then get mocked and even jailed for it. And it turns into a meme and a Seinfeld joke and The Simpsons and The Office and Modern Family, and Frasier, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Family Guy, and then Archie explained why it shouldn't be joked about in Tropic Thunder. Wasn't he the dude playing another dude? No, he was the dude playing the dude disguised as another dude. We had a similar case in Sweden, where a man was accused to have killed his wife on their very rural property. His testimony was that he heard screaming from the nearby river and ran down to find his wife dead, and that he heard someone swim away in the darkness. He was jailed and tried in court, but freed due to a lack of evidence, but was still prime suspect. The wife was so badly abused that they tested their lawnmower for blood and tried running over dolls with it to see if they could reproduce the damage. After several years, someone tested the wife's jacket and found it was full of male elk saliva, murdered by an elk. Oh wow. Big deer-type animals can be territorial and very dangerous, especially males. They're huge and they can kick and ram you fucking hard. What's also awful is that a lot of people still doubt it even after the film came out. It's not until much more recently, when there has been verified dingo attacks on small children, decades later, that the original naysayers are starting to concede that she was most likely innocent. This has been with her almost all of her adult life. At one point she merely described how a dingo eats its prey during an interview to help people understand how the evidence matched up, and she was torn apart for not seeming traumatized as she described what a dingo does when it feasts. Similarly, the lady who sued McDonald's after getting burnt by coffee was wrongly maligned by the public. She honestly should have sued their dumb asses again for slander, because that was a smear campaign run by McDonald's after the jury that heard the woman's case was so mortified by how deeply irrevocably wrong and fucked up McDays was in this case, and awarded the woman a landmark amount of money. Knowing absolutely nothing about the legal world, I like to believe she could have won a slander case. Landmark amount of money that only covered her medical and legal bills. She got almost nothing. I don't know if I'd consider it a landmark amount of money, but she was awarded $2.9 million, not just her medical and legal bills. She initially sued for just those bills and McDonald's turned her down. The judge made a statement by awarding her the equivalent of 2 full days of coffee sales. I don't know if I consider it a landmark amount of money, but she was awarded $2.9 million. She was awarded that by the jury, but the judge reduced it down to less than $1 million. And then McDonald's used every trick in the book to delay paying her until she died before collecting even half of it. Ah, you are correct. That part I did not know. That is still a lot more than the medical and legal bills, but too bad it wasn't the full 2.9. Brilliant prayer by McDonald's there. I hear it all the time and counter with fused vagina and how she just wanted medical expenses. I also heard people saying, here's the best example of a frivolous lawsuit, and citing that case. I later read that she was horribly disfigured, but you probably won't hear that often. Editor. Official quote from Wiki the Plaintiff. Stella Liebeck, 1912, 2004. A 79-year-old woman suffered third-degree burns in her pelvic region when she accidentally spilled coffee in her lap after purchasing it from a McDonald's restaurant. She was hospitalized for 8 days while undergoing skin grafting, followed by 2 years of medical treatment. Liebeck died on August 5, 2004, at age 91. According to her daughter, the burns and court proceedings had taken their toll. And in the years following the settlement, Liebeck had no quality of life. She said the settlement had paid for a live-in nurse. Hetz. N. Wikipedia or Wikilia Beck McDonald percent 27's restaurants. It was only an 8-day hospital stat because she couldn't afford to stay longer. She wanted to sue to merely repay her medical needs, get all the treatment she needed, and McDonald's destroyed her. She couldn't fully stand up, the burns were so severe. I was young when that happened, but I remember all the older people mocking her and discussing how the world had changed. We were becoming a litigious society. That woman deserved to be compensated. She suffered. Look up Kathleen Forbig as well. Similar story, except Forbig was convicted and imprisoned in 2003 and pardoned and released this year. Wrongful conviction and 20 years of prison after losing 4 children. Absolutely horrifying what she has been through. Joseph Lister, one of the first doctors to publicly endorse germ theory and recommend disinfection. At the time, surgeons would literally move from an amputation to an autopsy to the delivery room, using the same tools, often without even cleaning the gore from their hands and clothes. When Lister recommended comprehensive disinfection between procedures, nearly the whole British medical community laughed at him. He spent years as a pariah gathering data from his own practice until he could finally prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that his methods reduced post-op infection by a staggering rate. Now he's known as the father of modern surgery. I don't know if I'd consider it a landmark amount of money, but she was awarded $2.9 million. She was awarded that by the jury, but the judge reduced it down to less than $1 million. And then McDonald's used every trick in the book to delay paying her until she died before collecting even half of it. Dominique Moceanu Dominque came forward in 2008, revealing abuse in USA gymnastics before the 2016 sexual abuse scandal. She was accused of being bitter, lying, and seeking attention. She was blacklisted by gymnastics coaches and received threatening emails accusing her of basically being a traitor. John Geddett was one of the USA national team coaches that sent her the following email in 2008. Dom, although I am waiting to see the final product, initial quotes and coverage from your Brian Gumble interview have me wondering how you can stab this sport in the back. John Geddett would later commit suicide following federal charges of child exploitation and child trafficking of his former gymnast. At least he had the famous mouthwash named after him, I presume. Johnny Lydon, when he said on the radio that Jimmy Savile was dodgy. I heard this too, given it a quick Google. Seemingly he said, I want to kill Jimmy Savile. He's a hypocrite. I bet he's into all kinds of seediness that we all know about, but aren't allowed to talk about. I know some rumors. The interview wasn't aired at the time, and he was banned from the BC. Probably more alarming is he was already alienated, ostracized by a lot of the BPP by that point, pushed out, so if Johnny was still hearing rumors, Saville's activities must have been well known all over the BBC. Sickening how many people must have stayed silent. Thing is, even if it had aired, it wouldn't have mattered. Lydon's entire shtick was to be outrageous and say and do shocking things, so people would have just thought it was him playing the Johnny Rotten character up as usual. The guy who came up with the theory of Pangaea and continental drift, Alfred Wegener. Not only that, we now have theories that Pangaea was only one of the many supercontinents that have existed throughout the eons. Nuna, Rodinia, Panotea, edit, misspelled Nuna. This bitch know about Pangaea. Brain, leave it alone. Alfred Wegener, interesting story about status quo in science. The issue with Wegener wasn't so much that his theory that the continents move was disregarded as ridiculous. It was more that the mechanism by which he proposed they moved ploughing through the oceanic crust like an icebreaker was considered completely unreasonable based on the energy it would require. Once evidence for a different mechanism was discovered, the theory became adopted relatively quickly. Edit. I should also point out that European scientists widely accepted many of the main tenets of continental drift in the 1920s, with scientists in the US Canada being far less receptive. Richard Jewell was blasted as being the Atlanta Olympic bomber when he was really just a guy helping people out down there. He deserved better. Poor guy died young too. He was only 44 years old. Natural causes. If I recall correctly, those natural causes were intensely exacerbated by the brutal stress he suffered in the court of public opinion. His portrayal by the actor Paul Walter Hauser was nothing short of brilliant. I could not imagine anyone else besides him. The guy also did a great job as Larry Hall, a real-life serial killer on a miniseries called Blackbird on Apple TV. Barry Marshall, and also Robin Warren, his co-researcher. Forever, the cause of peptic ulcers was believed to be stress, spicy food, and too much acid production. They believed it was actually of bacterial origin. No one believed them. They were ridiculed because the belief was that bacteria couldn't survive in the acidic environment of the stomach. Not until Barry took a cocktail of pylori bacteria, which caused him to have massive inflammation of the stomach, which was found to be colonized with the bacteria, but a course of antibiotics later and it was gone. One Nobel Prize later, and now the treatment of peptic ulcers is turned on its head, and instead of months or years of discomfort, it can often be sorted with a week or two course of antibiotics. Edit. Marshall, not Marshall. I used to really worry about getting an ulcer from all the stress I was under. One of the things that stressed me out was the prospect of getting an ulcer from all the stress I was under. I had a flatmate once who was a pharma rep whose job was to go around us trying to get them to prescribe her company's pharmaceuticals. Selling drugs to reduce acid production was a big part of her job. This was right after it had been pretty much proven that Marshall and Warren's treatment worked. I cornered her about this, and eventually she admitted her job was to discredit their work, even though she knew it was effective. She proved to be a deceptive bitch in other ways. A bit later, never trust someone whose job is to bullshit fluidly for a living. That's a good one. You used to hear a lot about people suffering from peptic ulcers when I was a kid 50 years ago, and nowadays you never hear about it. Problem solved. Martha Mitchell, after whom the Martha Mitchell effect is named, Watergate whistleblower. She was the wife of the US ag at the time, John Mitchell. Despite being known privately to suffer from a fair bit of social anxiety, she was nevertheless outspoken and was seen as a little eccentric. This ended up being used against her by, among other people, her own husband, who at one point had her kidnapped in the middle of a phone call to a reporter over this, to thoroughly publicly discredit, mock, and belittle her when she blew the whistle on Watergate, though she initially believed. Her husband was an innocent fall guy. Nixon actually blamed her for Watergate, saying she was a distraction to Mitchell, and that without her, Watergate never even would have happened, which is just why. Aside from her son, her family abandoned her until full details of Watergate became more widely publicly known, and one of the people involved in the kidnapping admitted it had happened. The Martha Mitchell effect is when a patient's true but extreme claims are either incorrectly or maliciously dismissed as delusions by a medical, especially professional, edit O, also Claire Patterson. Effects of lead in gasoline and in food packaging. Taps. UW Thardian, Conscience 2014, the 25th, Thandi, Prusner, neurologist, Nobel doesn't wipe skepticism. Away Stanley Prusner. Everyone who was anyone in science knew that proteins couldn't be an infectious agent. They weren't even alive. He suffered so much mockery and skepticism until the mad cow disease and Kuru etc. were found to be precisely what he had described. Ignaz Semmelweis. The world didn't know about germs yet, but he saw that way less women were dying from childbirth when midwives attended the births than when doctors did. Doctors were coming from autopsies and wrecking women's shit. Ignaz suggested they start washing their hands, and people lost their fucking minds. Doctors ridiculed him, and everyone hated him. He had a nervous breakdown, was committed to an insane asylum, beaten by the guards, and died from a gangrenous wound as a result of the beating. Imagine being trolled to death, then being proven to be one of the rightest humans who ever lived. My ghost would slowly push the earth into the sun. It's so hot where I live that it feels like that's happening, so maybe he is getting his revenge. I believe they actually instituted the measure at one hospital and infant deaths plunged. Then, for some reason, pressure from doctors, they reverted back to the old way and deaths went back up. The idea of doctors washing their hands was lost for 30 more years. What? I am a gentleman, and a gentleman's hands are never dirty. Literally the response of doctors at the time when told to wash their hands. He was also his own worst enemy. Although the thesis contains passages of clearly written clinical detail, they are frequently interrupted by passages directed at his critics that are muddled, dogmatic, and extremely quarrelsome. At one point, he devoted 64 pages to a furious attack on Skanzany, an obstetrician at Prague who had mildly questioned some of Semmelweis's beliefs. Semmelweis wrote his thesis feverishly, all in a great hurry, constantly writing fresh chapters, repeating portions without coordination, and constantly hurrying the manuscript off to the printers without revision. Semmelweis wrote a second book in 1861, which consists entirely of intemperate attacks on his critics. It is clearly not a book by a sane and balanced medical scientist. Semmelweis deserves to be remembered for his observation in 1847 that making medical students wash their hands in a disinfectant solution before going from the post-mortem room to the lying in wards of the Vienna lying in hospital led to a fall in mortality due to puerperal fever from a very high level to a moderate level. It was Semmelweis' misfortune to be so hypersensitive to criticism that, although his friends implored him to publish this work, he wrote nothing until he began his thesis in the late 1850s. By this time it was clear that he was in the early stages of a psychosis. The nature of the psychosis is still uncertain, as is the cause of his death in a lunatic asylum, but it was probably a manic-depressive psychosis, or possibly syphilis, an occupational hazard of gynecologists before surgical gloves were introduced. He didn't discover it. He was told by midwives over and over and over until he looked into it. Midwives at the hospital observed that when doctors delivered babies, mothers were at a higher risk. Any housewife knew that food would spoil faster if handled with dirty hands, and they always used vinegar solutions to clean their hands, tools, and surfaces. Any housewife would do this, and midwives did it because mothers and their babies are more important than pumpkin preserve. Only doctors never washed their grubby hands, while it was a deeply ingrained habit in most midwives. Semmelweis listened to women. No wonder they locked him away. This was also the age of "you have ghosts in your blood. Let's do some cocaine about it." So, let's not pretend the decision-makers needed a reason to be illogical. "You have ghosts in your blood. Let's do some cocaine about it." That is a perfect album title. Wrote an econ paper in 2007 about the housing market crashing and was told the housing market never crashes. Can you write another paper about the housing market crashing next year? Sincerely, a Canadian. So did you receive an apology the next year? The journalists who maintained Lance Armstrong was doping when he was winning the Tour de France. I remember they were mocked because they admittedly went to extremes hunting for evidence. I remember reports of them sifting through Armstrong's trap. Lance Armstrong was a great story, a testicular cancer survivor who beat the disease and went on to set the record for most Tour de France victories. Was it 7? He was untouchable. Anyone contesting he was cheating was shaped. I remember the journalists investigating him were mostly French, so they were dismissed because they were sour that an American was breaking the Tour de France record. I remember other tour winners such as Greg LeMond and Floyd Landis, also contesting that Armstrong was cheating and both being silenced, shamed. Landis had tested positive himself for doping, so he wasn't considered a reliable source. I remember with LeMond they dug into his history and brought up child abuse he suffered as a result of him making claims against Armstrong. Turns out they were all right. I remember hearing stories that he was just a genetic freak, a mutant born with unusually large lungs and a heart that made him almost superhuman. It turns out he was just a doper. Patricia Stallings comes to mind. Convicted of poisoning her first child, gave birth in prison, kid got taken away, and the kid also dies. Instead of poisoning, it was now found it was a genetic defect that had similar effect as poisoning with antifreeze. Looks like all replies to your comment are bots copy-pasting from other top comments. John Yudkin was a food scientist who tried hard to push the idea that sugar caused heart disease and obesity amongst other conditions. He suggested a low-carb diet for weight loss in 1958. The sugar industry paid scientists like Ansel Keys and Mark Hegsted to downplay this connection and suggest that dietary fat caused obesity and heart disease. Massive lobbying helped pro-sugar scientists to become advisors to government and officially suggest a low-fat diet to prevent heart disease. Taking fat out of food makes it taste bad, so what do they add? More sugar, causing the food to be unhealthier. The demonizing of fat lasted well into the 2000s and often still persists to this day. I've had this conversation with people loads of times. There's a documentary out there. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name, where they actually have footage from the 50s congressional hearings on this exact topic. The conclusion I always state is that if fat had a lobbying group, who knows how things could have been. If they called it something other than fat, it would help too. Fat sounds disgusting. Sugar sounds pleasant. Fat should try to get rebranded to lipids. The McDonald's coffee burn incident. She didn't want it to be a spectacle. She just wanted her medical bills paid. She wanted her medical bills paid because she had third-degree burns on her vagina. Coffee shouldn't be that hot. It was ultimately the lawyers and the jury that determined the payout. She had no say in any of it. Ear labia literally fused together from the burns. Fat should try to get rebranded to lipids. Alan Turing. It crushes my soul just thinking about how much he changed computer science and computation, only to have such a horrible end of life. Without him would have lasted far longer and cost so many more lives. His story hurts to read about. He saved millions of lives only to be chemically castrated for sleeping with another dude. It's disgusting how he was treated. This needs more upvotes. He deserves so much better, but of course no matter how brilliant you are, gay men got absolutely no sympathy back then. Rose McGowan for calling out Harvey Weinstein. That Roman that gave Jesus vinegar to drink. Many medieval Christian writers saw the offering of vinegar wine as an act of torture rather than mercy. But turns out that the Roman military gave their soldiers a water vinegar mix to drink, so the Roman soldier shared with Jesus some of what he had to drink. Yeah, it was basically Roman Gatorade. Nicolaus Copernicus theorized that the planets actually circle the sun instead of the other way around. The church initially accepted heliocentricity but banned his views in 1600. He will forever be remembered for setting up one of my favorite insults of all time, Copernicus called. It turns out you're not the center of the universe. Jon Snow. He tried to remove the handle of a water pump in London that was drawing its water downstream from a sewage pipe. People who drew water from the pump caught cholera. Dr. Joseph Goldberger. He was the doctor that discovered the cause of the pellagra epidemic that was sweeping the southern USA. He linked it to a bad diet, specifically a corn-heavy diet. Cornmeal and grits were a southern staple and an incredibly cheap way to feed orphans, prisoners, and the poor. Pellagra is caused by a lack of vitamin 3, aka niacin. Normally, corn is high in niacin, but that niacin is locked up and unavailable to the human digestive system unless the corn is treated. A car softened, typically with lye. In the early 1900s, manufacturers switched to a different process that eliminated this treatment with lye. Corn was no longer softened. Then people, especially the poor, prisoners and orphans, started dying of pellagra. Some orphanages and prisons had a death rate of over 40%. Tens of thousands were dying annually. Through a series of experiments, Goldberger proved that it was a corn-heavy diet that caused pellagra. He cured it in 2 institutions just by adding vegetables to their diet. He also caused it in 14 prisoner volunteers. But, and this is the important part, he was Jewish, and he was trying to tell Southerners they were doing something wrong. So he was ridiculed and ignored, and pellagra continued to kill tens of thousands in the USA, and sicken tens of thousands more, for decades. When Goldberger died in 1929, pellagra continued to kill tens of thousands annually, 15 years after he had found the cure. It would continue to kill thousands for another couple of decades until someone more acceptable, Conrad Elvefjem, confirmed Goldberger's work in the late 1930s. All because Southerners didn't want a Jew telling them that they were doing something wrong. He was insulting their Southern heritage. By God, peace. Insulting their Southern heritage is not my words. It's the words of the Southern politicians who pulled his funding and campaigned for his removal from the U.S. Public Health Service. The half-dozen or so scientists and physicians who waged a decades-long struggle in the 1930s, 70s to prove that lead exposure was bad, and dusting everything with lead by burning it in gasoline was bad. The industry opposition was unreal. I know Needleman at least had his work shut down for a few years as his university conducted a thorough investigation for scientific misconduct. Dr. John Leal, the first man to chlorinate drinking water to kill germs. Only chlorine is a deadly poison, so he did so secretly for a couple months at first. The judge was incredulous that a man would poison the water supply from which his own son drank, but Leal said that it was the safest water in the world, and he was right. Suitably diluted, the chlorine does no notable damage to humans' worlds of hurt to bacteria. Stanislav Petrov. More people need to know his name. He literally, quite literally, saved the world. Saved the world from nuclear ruin, simply because he was stubborn and refused to believe the computing error. He went against his position orders and was consequently sacked by the USR and lived an isolated life. Not necessarily vilified by all, but vilified by the USR and ignored by the West. Put some respect on his name. And he didn't even win a Nobel Peace Prize, died in 2017. Recommend watching Stanislav Petrov, the man who saved the world. The Leave Brittany Alone guy came here to say this. He was mocked by everyone when the video came out, but he was right. Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, talking about Jimmy Savile in 1978. The BBC banned him, Lydon, at the time, I think, and we all know how that panned out. Pearl Jam, Ticketmaster, Sinead O'Connor. She was the one that made me think of this question. If you want to see what actual cancel culture is, look at what happened to her. And all those years of Sinead's off her rocker again stories in the media. And then when she dies, suddenly they're gushing about her bravery and talent. Cancel culture has always been around. Sinead O'Connor, obviously. Socrates. Also Janet Jackson. But curiously, not Justin Timberlake, Muhammad Ali, when he came out against the Vietnam War, Alan Turing, War Churchill, Gary Webb, Pee Wee Herman. The list goes on. The difference is that the targets back then were all non-establishment figures, not part of the power structure. What's happening today is that due to social media, some of the targets are now part of the power structure, part of the ruling class, or their apologists. So now it's a big problem. The wrong people are being cancelled. Don't forget the Dixie Chicks. They were one of the most popular country western acts of the time, and when they spoke out against the war in Iraq, that all but killed their career. I would say the UN Chief Inspector, Hans Blix, who said in a 2003 report that the UN investigation team had found no evidence of WIMD in Iraq, completely torn apart by the American government, public and press. And yet, no WIMD were ever found in Iraq. Corey Feldman. Fuck Barbara Walters for the way she treated him. You're damaging an entire industry. Charles Darwin. There's a whole book on how scared he was to publish his work because he knew he'd be hated for it. The Reluctant Mr. Darwin by David Quammen. In fairness, at the time, there was a very good reason not to believe Darwin. Most agreed that his theory would require a long time, at least 100 million years, but probably more than 1 billion. Then along came Lord Kelvin and his pesky laws of thermodynamics. He calculated that the sun, and thus the earth, could not be more than 20 million years old. Other esteemed physicists of the day agreed, getting numbers in and around that value via a completely different method. Even Darwin's own son did an independent calculation based on the moon and Earth's rotation, and arrived at 58 million years old. Right up to his death, Darwin acknowledged the age of the Earth as the major issue facing his theory. He opined that the calculations might be based on faulty assumptions, that we don't understand the internal workings of the Earth or the Sun, and that perhaps some future discovery would invalidate the calculation. In this he was completely correct. The missing components were radioactivity in the Earth and nuclear fusion in the Sun. Once you account for those, the ages go up to billions of years old. Plenty of time for evolution by natural selection. But this was only discovered after Darwin died, so certainly during his life there was good reason not to trust his theory. Although many still did trust it, because the evidence was incredibly compelling and constantly piling up. Richard Jewell. Damn it, you beat me to it. Richard Jewell. A security guard who found a bomb in a bag at the Olympics. But for some reason, local police told the media that he was a suspect and the press absolutely roasted him for months. Turned out he was not the bomber. He was in fact a real-life hero who possibly saved many lives. But his life was absolutely ruined. The press quickly squashed the story of the real bomber BC. They would have to admit how wrong they were about Richard Jewell first. Years later, he couldn't get work, because even after the real bomber was caught, people still thought he did it. Side quiz. If you were around in the early 2000s, you probably know who Richard Jewell is, but can anyone on this thread remember the name of the real bomber without looking it up?